Hi everyone, Sam Pearson here. This video is the second in our series on designing a tabletop wargame, where we're looking at not only creating a game from scratch, and I'm taking you through the process step by step, I'm also showcasing the wargame that I'm working on at the moment, a game called Black Death City, which is my take on the Mordheim formula. So it's a bunch of fantasy warbands duking it out in a big ruined city. In the first video, we looked at all the different parts that make up a wargame that you will need to consider when designing one, and then we looked at how to establish a vision for your game. And by vision, I mean we created a document, and this document started with a pitch, a simple pitch of 100 words. We then took elements of that pitch and expanded on them in detail through a series of slides. And finally, we came up with 5 design tenets to live by. These were 5 sentences that each encapsulated a different part of your game's vision, and we ranked them in order, so if you ever need to break one of them, you can do so in service of one of the tenets higher up. The first reason for creating this vision document is that it sets direction, and now that we begin working on the game proper, that's going to be very useful. But above that, the vision document is there to serve as a metric. We can use it to evaluate any and all rules that we might want to put into our wargame. We can use it to answer that fundamental question: is a rule right for my wargame or not? You don't need to have watched that video before this one, but I will be referring to my vision document throughout this video. So if you haven't seen it yet, make sure you watch it after this video. I'll put a link down in the description below and also at the end. So today we're going to start writing some actual rules. We're going to be looking at turn structure and combat and designing those systems for our wargame. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the attack sequence. So how does one unit deal damage to another unit? And we're going to be looking at unit profiles and weapon profiles too. I'm going to show you what I have chosen for my game, Black Death City, and importantly, how I decided upon those mechanics. It's going to be a lot of fun, so let's get started. Now, before we jump into the video proper, I want to quickly mention that the next video is going to be me answering any questions you might have, an AMA, Ask Me Anything. So this is a call out for you to send me some questions. It was something that I promised for when we reached 10,000 subscribers, and we've now reached that milestone. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. I'll put a pinned comment down below where you can send me a question and I'll do my best to answer it in the video. Also, if you see a question already in there that you would like to hear me answer, make sure you give it a thumbs up so I can know which ones in particular people are keen to know. It can be literally anything, by the way. It could be questions on a games design topic such as randomness versus skill. You could ask about what's my favorite codex or battle tome that I worked on. What are some games I wish I could have designed? I don't know why, but I'm a little bit nervous about this one. What will I do if there are no questions? Wouldn't I look like a fool? One caveat is I worked at Games Workshop as a games designer for many years, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about Warhammer and my time while working there. You guys will know I always say I loved working there, and when it comes to the games, although I've got my gripes, generally I love them. But that being said, I won't answer any questions on why Games Workshop does or does not do certain things, especially business related. So for example, don't ask me why Beasts of Chaos were put into Legends, or what's the future of Warcry. Those sorts of questions, either I'm not qualified to answer them or I don't want to be the source of information. But feel free to ask me what were particularly memorable projects I got to work on while I was there. What's the most embarrassing rule I wrote at Games Workshop? What games do I wish I could have had the chance to work on while I was there? Things like that. So pinned comment down below, send me your questions. Right, now it's time to design some combat. I'll see you after the jump. In the first video, we identified the 5 core parts of every wargame: turn structure, combat, list building, scenarios, and setting. Now it's time to start writing the game proper. But before we dive in, it's important to think of what our next milestone is. Ultimately, our goal is to create a fully fledged wargame, and to do so, we'll need to fully develop each of these 5 areas in full, as well as a campaign system in the case of my game too. But that's all still a bit down the line. Our next major milestone is to create a working prototype for the game first. This is something I talked about in my video on developing Warcry at Games Workshop, and it is an industry standard practice. So what is a working prototype? Well, it's a slice through the game with just enough details to allow a full battle on the tabletop to be played through. We focus on a working prototype first because it allows us to see the whole game in action before we spend too much time developing any one area. If you were working in a company, the prototype would also be shown to key stakeholders, mainly the management team, to get sign off on the direction of the game. For us working as individuals, the working prototype is still invaluable as it will allow us to see all of the individual elements working together as a whole. And this enables us to make sure everything is in sync so that we don't go down any rabbit holes by fleshing out mechanics that don't work in conjunction with each other. It's also just really good for getting us over the finish line. Technically, once you have the prototype done, you have a finished game. Yes, it might be rough around the edges. Yes, it might not have all the factions that you have planned, but it will be a game nonetheless, one that you can start polishing and expanding upon from there on out. If making a game is like crossing a hill, after we finish the prototype, we've reached the crest and it's downhill from there on out. So the prototype is going to be a vertical slice through each of the 5 elements that make up a wargame: turn structure, combat, list building, scenarios, and setting. We're going to need to think about all of them in some regard, but interestingly, it is weighted towards some areas more than others. If I was to draw a diagram to show that weight, it would look like this. In terms of list building, scenarios, and setting, we only need the thinnest of slices. Our prototype only needs one scenario to play through, and it only needs the skeleton of 2 factions to face off against each other. On the other hand, turn structure and combat, and by the way, when I say combat, I'm covering both moving and attacking. With these 2 sections, we need to have them almost fleshed out in full. There can be some elements left grey. For example, if a certain subsection of fighters are wizards, you could leave off the magic rules, and this could be the same with other subsets like flyers or vehicles, for example. But in general, you will need to get a good grasp of how the core rules of your game is going to work. How do the turns play out? What can players do on each of their turns? How do units move and attack? And that's going to be the topic of this video. In the last video, I said the next step after creating your vision document was to put together some detailed notes on each of the 5 sections and to begin writing the rules from there. Now I'm going to explore that in a bit more detail and show you the process that I use to go about writing the rules, because sometimes it's fairly straightforward and sometimes it can get a bit tricky. In the case of Black Death City, the turn structure was actually quite easy to put together because I knew the sort of system that I wanted from the get-go. The rules for combat, on the other hand, were a lot harder. I had this idea that I wanted to blend the attack sequence of Warcry with the attack sequence of classic Warhammer. For those who don't know, Warcry's attack sequence is a single dice roll that takes you all the way through to damage. I wanted to somehow blend that with the classic hit, wound and save roll that you have in almost every classic Warhammer game. But as I went going about it, I was really unsure on any more details other than that, and I was unsure on what sort of ratio I should mix the 2 together. So developing the rules in that area was going to be a lot more of an exploratory process. I needed to figure out the design space first that I wanted the mechanics to occupy before I could go about creating the mechanics to sit in there. And I have a specific process that will allow you to do that effectively. But I'll talk more on the attack sequence a little bit later. Let's look at the turn structure first. I knew for the turn structure that I wanted to use Warcry as a basis. Warcry is alternating activations, which I think best gets across the frantic nature of a street skirmish, which is the setting also for Black Death City. As I was sketching out the initial system, the 3 questions I kept in mind were: what are the shortcomings of Warcry's system? How could I overcome them? What does and does not align with my game's vision? These 3 questions guided me, and the system I came up with is as follows. In Black Death City, players will each command a warband of around 10 fighters, and every round they will take it in turns to activate fighters one at a time, with play going back and forth until all fighters have been activated. Like in Warcry, when a fighter activates, they'll be able to make 2 actions, and there will be a range of actions to choose from: move, attack, cast a spell, etc. But one difference is I'm going to limit fighters to 1 move action and 1 other action each activation. In fact, moves won't be referred to as actions, so a fighter can can make one move and one action in whichever order the player chooses. This came about by thinking on the weaknesses of Warcry and my experience in designing that game. In Warcry, players can use two actions to move twice or to attack twice, and I didn't like the certain behaviors a double move and a double attack encouraged with the players, especially the double attack. For ranged weapons, it encouraged camping. Why move when I can just shoot again? And for melee weapons, it meant charging into an unactivated enemy was often a death sentence, as you would attack them once, likely not enough to bring them down, and then take 2 attacks back in return. Mark Rosewater, the lead designer for Magic the Gathering, has a lesson in his 20 design lessons presentation that stipulates, make the fun part also the correct strategy for winning. By the way, this design presentation that Mark gives at the GDC is just incredible, and I recommend every budding games designer gives it a watch. I'll put a link down below. The crux of this lesson is that players will latch onto winning strategies even if it is not the most fun thing to do in a game. So it is our job as designers to make sure the winning strategy is the fun strategy. And for me, the fun in a skirmish wargame is warbands both maneuvering and attacking in equal measure. So this limit of one move and one action is a way of enshrining that. There were a few other details to iron out when it came to the turn structure, and here I used my vision document to help guide me. For example, one of the key parts of my vision was the idea of war as simulation, which was a key part for getting that old school Warhammer feel into my game. This is a coin with two sides. On the one hand, it is a focus on realism and immersive rules. On the other hand, it is about avoiding board gamey style mechanics such as meta currencies, command points, or game pieces like chits or playing cards. For this reason, I decided the alternating activation system of Black Death City would not use any gimmicks, such as bolt actions, pulling a dice out of bag, or Warcry's dice rolling initiative where you count up the matching combos. These systems are both great and signatures of their respective games, but the problem for me is that including systems like this will open up design space that would make sense to capitalize on, and that design space would be things like mechanics that allow a player to add an extra dice into the bag, or gain extra wild dice, or can change the result of one dice to another, and so on. And at this point, the game will have drifted far from my vision of one that focuses on realism and simulation and has mechanics that don't draw attention to the game aspect. Now, that did leave a question of how to deal with the action economy. For those who have watched my video on Igo-Yugo versus alternating activations, one inherent problem with alternating activations is that when one side vastly outnumbers the other, they can waste their opponent's actions by activating inconsequential fighters first, and then once their opponent is out of activations, they are free to dogpile onto objectives or gang up on individual enemies. To fix this issue in Black Death City, I am going to take Kill Team's approach, which is to allow the player out of activations to activate fighters a second time, something I'm going to call a surge activation. But each time they do so, they can only make one move or action, not both. I went with this approach because it has some rubber banding to it. Usually the player with fewer fighters will be the weaker of the two warbands. That's not always the case. If you have a strong divergence in the strengths of individual units, 3 giants versus 4 units of goblins, for example. But in Black Death City, most of the individual fighters will be human-sized with roughly similar abilities and skills. So here, as well as softening the action economy, it also acts as an underdog mechanic of sorts. And if you remember, underdog mechanics were one of my most important design tenets. The city hungers for hubris. So it fits the vision of my game perfectly. So hopefully here you can see how I was able to use my vision document to guide me in designing this section. Like I said, deciding upon the turn structure was relatively simple because I already had a basic structure in mind. I wanted an alternating activation system where fighters were able to do 2 things on each of their turns. And so I was able to use my experience in designing a similar system for Warcry to address what I perceive as its shortcomings and to gently nudge the mechanics so that they align better with my game's vision. Moving on to the rules for combat and the attack sequence, this was a lot harder because I didn't have as clear a picture in my mind of what I wanted the system to be. And so this is where I used a process called experience-led design to help guide me in the rules writing. My starting point for the attack sequence was this idea of blending Warcry's attack sequence with the classic Warhammer attack sequence. This is reflected in the vision of my game. In the initial pitch, I said I wanted a classic Warhammer feel with a modern twist. So Mordheim plus Warcry, this fits the bill. But I think an important question I need to ask myself at this point is why? Why do I want to blend these 2 attack sequences? And what do I think the merits of each system are? Let's look at each game's attack sequence first and discuss their strengths and shortcomings. shortcomings. So to begin with, Warcry's attack sequence is a single roll of the dice called the attack roll. Each time you make an attack roll, you usually roll 3 or 4 dice together. It depends on the weapon, but even a standard sword equipped by a grunt will have 3 attacks normally. You roll the dice and use a comparison to determine the amount of damage inflicted on the target. The comparison is the strength of the weapon versus the toughness of the target. If the strength is higher, every roll of a 3 or more scores a hit. If they are equal, it's a 4 or more. And if the toughness is greater, it's a 5 or more. In addition, rolls of a natural 6 score something called a critical hit, regardless of the toughness of the target. Once you work out how many attacks hit, you move straight to the end of the sequence and apply the damage. The damage of the weapon is split into 2 characteristics. The first is the damage applied for each regular hit, and the second is the damage applied for each critical hit. You can see here it is 1 and 3. So this is Warcry's attack sequence. It's a single step dice roll, and you can see it's quite different to the classic Warhammer attack sequence. One aspect I like about this system is you roll multiple dice, even for something like a standard sword. As a result, every dice rolled feels like the swing of a blade or the loosening of an arrow, and as a result it feels quite visceral. I also like that there's a range of damage each attack gives. This standard attack with a sword can inflict anywhere from 0 to 9 damage in total, and this in turn allows fighters to have a pool of hit points to soak up the attacks. A standard fighter in Warcry will have 10 wounds, and together this allows for an attritional style of play. Over the course of the battle, fighters will eventually have their wounds whittled down the longer they fight. Let's look now at the classic Warhammer attack sequence, which in comparison has quite a lot of steps. In most Warhammer games, every attack, usually represented by a single dice, will have to be rolled multiple times as it moves through a sequence of steps. It starts with the hit roll, then the wound roll, and lastly the save roll. And then depending on which Warhammer game in particular you are looking at, there might be more steps added in. For example, in modern 40k and Age of Sigmar, they'll often have a damage roll in there after the save roll to represent powerful weapons that can bring down monsters or tanks in a single hit. In addition, there is also often a ward roll or a feel no pain roll, which comes right at the end and is a second chance for the defender to stop the attack. The 40k players among you are probably groaning right now because in the current game these 2 extra steps, random damage plus a feel no pain save, essentially slow the game down to 1 frame per second when they both come into play, and this is due to the way they interact with each other. In old Mordheim, which also uses the classic hit, wound and save sequence, there was an extra step at the start of the sequence for comparing initiative values to see who struck first, then another extra step between the hit and wound rolls with a chance to parry, as well as a critical hit step that came after the wound roll if you rolled a 6 to wound. So this classic attack sequence has quite a few different iterations, but in all cases it's a much more complex system than Warcry with lots and lots of dice rolling. And while this goes against my vision for Black Death City, where I stipulated I want simple, elegant inputs in my rules, it does still have some strengths to it as well. Because it is quite detailed, with all these extra steps, the design space it creates is quite large and it can, as a result, cater for lots of different archetypes. Archetypes being different types of fighter and different types of weapon, and it is able to cater for many archetypes that Warcry struggles with in comparison. For example, in Mordheim, a fighter with a high initiative characteristic, a high weapon skill, and armed with a sword and buckler interacts with these steps, initiative, hit roll, and parry roll, in a special way to create an archetype I call the duelist. This is a fighter that can go toe-to-toe with bigger, fearsome creatures by denying them the chance to even land a blow. Their higher initiative lets them strike first outside of charges. Their higher weapon skill makes both their attacks easier to land whilst denying their opponent the same, and even if an attack does land on them, they have a chance to parry it. Warcry, on the other hand, really struggles with the duelist archetype. The main reason is attacking is a one-sided affair in the game where the defender of an attack action has to stand there as a punching bag. There is no chance to strike first, parry a blow, or anything else. If they want to stick around and attack back, they need to be able to take a hit and survive. So there are some merits to the classic Warhammer attack sequence for sure, and this is why I'm going to blend the two. But the problem I had is knowing how much should I blend them. We've got a 1-step system and a 6-step system. Should Black Death City have a 2-step system, a 3-step system, and what should be included and what should be omitted? In this case, my vision document isn't granular enough to give me direction, and so I use a process called experience-led design. Let's see how it works. Experience-led design is a top-down design approach. Top-down design means to look at the big picture first and then fill in the details. In tabletop games design, top-down design also usually means starting from the world building, the setting first, whereas bottom-up approach focuses on the mechanics. A good way to think about it is to visualize a Magic the Gathering card. Top-down design is about starting with the top half of the card, the name, the artwork, its theme, world building and story, and then creating mechanics that fit. Bottom-up design is about focusing the mechanics first, the pure math and the gameplay, and then creating a theme that can sit on top. I think it's easy to visualize top-down design when thinking about the rules for a unit. Working at Games Workshop, our starting point for a new unit was often to look at the miniature, and we would use that to shape how many wounds does it have, what is its save characteristic, and so on. But how can we approach something like the attack sequence from the top down? After all, it's just a series of mechanics, right? A strict order on operations on how one unit inflicts damage to another. Furthermore, we don't have any world building in particular to draw upon. Sure, I have this idea that Black Death City is about warbands fighting in a big ruined city, but how does that tell me if a sword should be a 1d6 attack or a 2d6 attack or something completely different, using d8s or opposed rolls or something like that? This is where experience-led design comes in, which is a method I like to use to design systems like attack sequences from the top down. What we are going to do is, rather than focusing on the mechanics, we are going to set about defining the experiences we want the players to have. In particular, we're going to focus on the most exciting experiences we want the players to have when playing our game. And we're going to use this to then shape the mechanics. We're going to create mechanics that can recreate those experiences on the tabletop. So let's see this in practice. Here are some experiences I want the players to have when playing Black Death City. Number 1. Fighters should be able to become skilled duelists that can survive in melee combat even when lightly armoured. This was the first one that came to mind, and it arose from thinking about the shortcomings of Warcry, where this archetype is very hard to capture mechanically. Number 2. Armour should always matter. Number 3. Heavy armor should allow a fighter to attack more aggressively. These two came about from different places. Armor should always matter comes from Warcry and Age of Sigmar. In Warcry, critical hits are on a natural 6 regardless of armor, and critical hits have this massive spike in damage. This results in the feeling of players fishing for crits. An attack feels like it doesn't really do anything unless you roll 1 or more 6s, and it also makes armor feel ineffective. No matter how heavily armored your fighter is, a couple of 6s will see them killed. Lastly, this meant that weapons that were best for taking out armoured foes were those with lots of attacks rather than a high strength, which is very unintuitive and immersion breaking. A similar thing can happen in Age of Sigmar with mortal wounds. These are attacks that bypass the attack sequence entirely and can undermine the importance of armour again, sometimes in ways that are unrealistic. The third experience, heavy armour should allow a fighter to attack more aggressively, came about from me watching lots of fight scenes, either from movies or from the YouTube channel Deckwitum. Watching movies or similar scenes is a great source of inspiration in figuring out the experiences you want the players to have. One fight scene in particular that struck a chord with me is this one in Roman Polanski's Macbeth, and in particular this scene here. I love the way it shows Macbeth using his armor to take the hit so that he can attack more aggressively. Often in movies and media like games, we portray melee combat like it is fencing, where the combatants try and block every single attack at all costs. Even if the fighter is head to toe in full plate, they will be blocking with their shield, parrying with their weapon, or rolling around like a raccoon to try and avoid any attack that comes their way. But in actual fact, armor could be used as a tool. You could trust in it protecting you from an attack so that you could rain down a relentless flurry onto your opponent. So these were the first 3 experiences that I wanted players to have. And at this point, it was coming clear to me that I wanted an attack sequence that could cater to 2 broad styles of combat. On the one end, there are the duelists, parrying and turning attacks aside, and on the other end, there are tanks that could use the protectiveness of their armor to give them more opportunities to attack. Thinking about this led to the 4th experience. Number 4, every melee combat should feel like a duel, full of unpredictable twists and turns, and catering to 2 different fighting styles, the duelist and the tank. Through thinking about and defining these player experiences, I can see now that I want Black Death City to shine a big spotlight on its melee combat. I want it to be fun, dramatic, cinematic. I want it to allow for compelling decision making on the part of the player. And I also want to have elements of unpredictability in there that could shape the game in dynamic ways. In my first video, I talked about how much I love the Overwatch and jamming rules in Space Hulk. They create this focal point of the game that is full of tension and drama and leads every game down surprising paths. I came to realise I want the melee combat in Black Death City to fill the same spot in my game. At this point, I feel like I've got enough experiences defined to start working on the attack sequence for melee combat. But my attack sequence also needs to encompass ranged combat too. So I define 2 final experiences, this time looking at ranged combat. Number 5. There should be a chance, even a slim chance, that a single arrow can kill a man. Number 6. But overall, ranged combat should take a backseat to melee combat. Players should want to settle their disputes out in the open, in hand-to-hand combat. These last 2 are a bit at odds with each other. I like the idea that an arrow can kill a man in a single shot, like King Harold at Hastings. This is something systems struggle with when fighters gain a pool of hit points, something that used to annoy me to no end when playing my stealth archer build in Oblivion. So this is a call to realism, but I also want ranged combat to take a back seat to melee combat. I want the games to be decided by exciting duels, not by overwhelming ranged firepower. So these 2 experiences for ranged combat, they do sit at odds with each other slightly, but I think that's fine. If you have 2 experiences that seem to sit at odds with each other, you just need to be aware that it's going to create a design challenge that you'll need to try and resolve. For me, it's the case that I want a single arrow to be able to kill a man, even a slight chance, but I don't want ranged firepower to be too overbearing, too dominating. If this proves impossible, then I will forego number 5, but you don't know until you've tried. Okay, so this is looking at experience-led design in action. With these 6 experiences outlined, I have defined what sort of design space I want my game to inhabit. Now I have a goal in developing my mechanics. I know how far to take them, how complicated to make certain areas. So if you are trying to figure out the attack sequence for your wargame or the resolution mechanic for your RPG, I suggest thinking first about the experiences you want players to have, drawing from both cinematic moments in movies you want to recreate and the shortcomings of other games that you wish to remedy. Lots of designers worry about whether their game should use something completely novel or not, or worry about pitching different dice systems against each other. For example, stressing over if they should use a stepped sequence like the hit, wound, save of Warhammer versus the opposed roles of something like Infinity. In truth, any system can work for your game, and your system does not have to be completely unique either. What's more important in my opinion is figuring out the experiences you want the players to have in your game and building the mechanics to cater to those first and foremost. Doing this exercise was actually a revelation for me. I went into this process of thinking I was going to mix Warcry and the classic Warhammer attack sequence in some way, but through defining the experiences first and then trying to build the mechanics around it, I realized that I want the melee combat to have a much bigger spotlight shined upon it. I wanted it to cater for 2 different styles of attack, the duelist and the tank. And this in turn actually led me to adding a 3rd game into the mix, Kill Team. Older Warhammer games such as Mordheim can create fighters that are duelists, and it can create those that are tanks. But there isn't really a choice between one or the other. A fighter in armor cannot forego parrying to get extra attacks. In addition, the parrying rules add an extra step to an already complex system. Mordheim is 6 steps with 4 table lookups, which very much goes against the idea of streamlined and elegant inputs, which I want in my game. Kill Team, on the other hand, has an elegant system that I think I can use as the basis for mine. In Kill Team, both players roll attacks simultaneously, and then there is this back and forth between dealing blows and parrying attacks. I like it in theory because it puts a meaningful choice at the heart of the attack sequence. Every successful attack becomes a currency the players can spend, and the dilemma the player is presented with is, should they spend it to deal damage or should they spend it to block an enemy attack? In practice, I find it not as fun to play through as I had hoped, and that's because after the attack rolls are made, it often plays out as a solved system, at least in my experience. The two players take a moment to look at the dice, and it usually becomes fairly obvious what the outcome will be, stripping away that meaningful player choice. For example, a common situation I find is one where blocking an opponent's attack isn't going to stop your fighter from dying, and so the only thing to do is deal as much damage as you can on the way out. It's not quite the swashbuckling back and forth that I want. So the first thing that comes to mind is adding back the armor roll to this system. In Kill Team, melee combat does not take armor into account, which I imagine was done to make melee combat seem very risky and deadly. But for Black Death City, adding it back in will do two very important things. Firstly, it will add some unpredictability back into the system to stop it being solved by the players. Now, when the attack rolls are made, every attack becomes a gamble. There is a chance armor will protect the fighter, and enough lucky saves could turn the battle on its head. Secondly, it creates that dichotomy between duelists and tanks that I want. Duelists will spend their successful attacks to turn aside enemy attacks, and I will look for ways to develop that design space further. Tanks, on the other hand, will be able to trust in their armor and swing without mercy, just like Macbeth. So this is the basis for my melee attack system. I'm going to use Kill Team style dueling, but I'm going to add in the armor roll as that helps create the two different fighting styles. But I didn't stop there. I then went and tweaked it in a few other ways to really get the gameplay that I want. So now I'm going to present Black Death City's attack sequence in full, at least where it is now in regards to getting ready for the prototype. And I'm also going to showcase what fighters and weapons will look like too. This is what a fighter profile is going to look like in Black Death City. Here we have a basic human called a guild mercenary to serve as our baseline. Of course, the art and graphic design is just in its early stages and is something I will work on alongside the development of the game itself. At first glance, this will look very classic Warhammer. That's deliberate. Black Death City will have a classic Warhammer feel, remember, but there are some key differences too, so let's look in more detail. Every fighter has a list of values associated with them. They are called values rather than characteristics, simply because that is fewer letters, and I know at some point that will be the difference between the rules fitting onto a page or not. The values are move, blade, bow, armor, initiative, willpower, and life. Move is the number of inches a single move can take the fighter. Blade and bow is their skill with melee weapons and ranged weapons respectively, like weapon skill and ballistic skill in any Warhammer game. And here the lower number the better, as it indicates the number you will need to land a successful attack when making attack rolls. Armor is similar, the lower the better. In Black Death City, the armor roll, or saving throw, is what I'm porting over from the classic Warhammer attack sequence. For this fighter it is currently 6+, and that is because they have not been equipped with any armor yet. Fighters will have a native armor value, and most weapons will not have rend, allowing you the chance to save attacks even for a fighter wearing robes. But more importantly, Black Death City will be a game of buying equipment, weapons and war gear to outfit your fighters with. So expect a whole range of different armor types to be able to equip your fighters with to increase that value. A typical armor value might be 4+ for a fighter with a cuirass and shield. For the last three stats, the higher the number the better. Initiative is used to determine who strikes the first blow in melee, and is also used for tests of dexterity such as falling. Willpower is going to predominantly be the value that wizards and priests use when casting spells, but will also be for tests of character such as giving an inspiring speech or overcoming the effects of poison. And life is hit points. Life is the amount of damage a fighter can take before they are brought down. Now, an important thing to note here is that the baseline for a human is currently 4. This might seem quite low, especially for players of Warcry. This is a deliberate change, and I'll talk about why when we look at the full attack sequence. 4 is my starting point for a baseline human, with a champion having 5, a warband leader having 6, and something like an ogre having 8. But that being said, this is something I'm going to keep my eye on, and depending on how it feels in the prototype, I might recalibrate it higher or lower. As you're working on getting your prototype finished, it is good to call out questions like this that we don't yet know the final answer for. Go with your gut feeling to begin with, but be ready to adjust the numbers once you get some games in. Let's look at weapons now. This is what weapons will look like in Black Death City. Here we have 4 examples: a sword, the battle axe, a dagger, and a great hammer. These look a little like Warcry weapons, but there is 4 important differences. The first is they are detached from the fighters. In Warcry, how does a sword work? No idea. It depends on who is holding it. Black Death City is going to be a game about customizing your fighters and their loadouts, so the weapons need to exist independently of the fighters. A sword is a sword, and it will work the same no matter who is equipped with it. Second is the introduction of the rend value. This is exactly like the rend characteristic in Age of Sigmar, modifying the armor roll. This creates a nice bit of design space to represent things like the battle axe here. Third is the box for weapon traits. These are universal special rules for weapons. One new innovation, at least I haven't seen it yet in another game, is going to be the introduction of reminder text. I was inspired here by Magic the Gathering with how some of its cards give a quick reminder of how a universal special rule such as vigilance or flying works, and others do not. So I've attempted that here. Every weapon trait is going to have a quick reminder of how it works, if there is space. This isn't the full rule, that will be contained elsewhere, but this should be enough to jog your memory. I always forget how weapon USRs work in games. For example, in Kill Team, I can never remember which way around Relentless and Ceaseless are. The idea here is that I won't need to write out the reminder text for every weapon. On a page of weapons, the reminder text will be written alongside the first time the USR appears, or when there is space. So if there is a weapon with lots of USRs, I might forgo the reminder text on some of them if it has already been printed elsewhere on the page. The final difference is the random crit damage. This is an important one for the game and goes hand in hand with a number of other parts of the game design. It adds another layer of unpredictability to the dueling in melee combat. Every critical hit on the stack could be 3 damage, almost enough to kill a regular human, or it could be 1. This will add another layer to consider in the player decision making when choosing to attack or parry, and add another way a melee combat can be flipped on its head. The last thing to talk about here is the absence of any strength value. I found that it wasn't needed for Black Death City. What the strength value gives you is the design space to represent big, powerful weapons. This was important in early editions of Warhammer games where your average fighter only had a single hit point. In Black Death City, fighters have multiple hit points represented by the life value. As such, there is adequate design space in the damage values to represent big powerful weapons instead, such as the Great Hammer here with its increased damage and crit damage values. I think this is an important lesson when trying to streamline your wargame design. Try and spot ways in which the same archetype for, say, a weapon can be created in multiple ways, and then cut out the way that has a more narrow purpose. Keep the one that's broader. I can represent strong weapons with high damage values, and I can represent big tough fighters like ogres with higher life values. This allows me to get rid of the strength and toughness comparison without reducing the amount of archetypes in my game. Okay, now that we've looked at the fighters and the weapons, let's look at the melee attack sequence in full. Melee attack action. The melee attack action represents a duel between two fighters as blades clash, daring parries and feints are made until a strike lands home. A fighter engaged in melee can make a melee attack action as follows. 1. Pick a target. 2. Pick weapons. 3. Determine initiative. 4. Make attack rolls. 5. Alternate attacks and parries. Step 1. Pick a target. The controlling player picks an enemy fighter engaged in melee with the activating fighter to be the target. The activating fighter is referred to as the attacking fighter and the target as the defending fighter. To add a quick note here, engaged in melee means being within 1 inch of an enemy fighter. Step 2. Pick weapons. Both players pick a melee weapon for their fighter to use. Now here I've added in a box out, and this is to cover a special type of weapon called an offhand weapon. If a fighter is not armed with a shield or a two-handed weapon, a second melee weapon with the offhand weapon trait can be picked for them to use. For example, a sword and a flail. This second weapon is referred to as the offhand weapon. Step 3. Determine initiative. If the attacking fighter charged this activation, they have the initiative. Otherwise, the players each roll a dice and add their fighter's initiative value to the result. The fighter with the higher total has the initiative. In the case of a tie, the attacking fighter has the initiative. Step 4. Make attack rolls. Attack rolls are made for both the attacking fighter and the defending fighter. To make an attack roll, the player rolls a number of dice equal to the attack's value of the weapons being used by their fighter. Attack rolls of a natural 6 are successful attacks, and they are critical hits. Otherwise, each attack roll that equals or exceeds the fighter's blade value is a successful attack. All other attack rolls are misses. And again, a box out for offhand attacks. If a fighter is using an offhand weapon in addition to another weapon, only one attack roll is made for the offhand weapon, regardless of the weapon's attacks value. For example, a fighter using a sword and an offhand flail would make 3 attack rolls for the sword and 1 attack roll for the flail. Use different color dice to avoid confusion. Step 5. Alternate attacks and parries. Starting with the fighter with initiative, the fighters take it in turns dealing attacks or parries as follows. Attack. One of the fighter's successful attacks is resolved. See below. Parry. To make a parry, the fighter must sacrifice one of their successful attacks and rolls a dice. On a 1, the parry fails. On a 2+, one of their opponent's successful attacks is parried and negated. To parry an opponent's critical hit, the fighter must sacrifice one of their critical hits. Keep alternating back and forth until both fighters have made all their attacks and parries, or until one of the fighters is taken down, whichever happens first. Then the action ends. Then boxed out, I have a sequence for resolving successful attacks. The reason why this is boxed out into its own sequence is ranged attacks are also going to feed into here later. To resolve a successful attack, be it from a melee attack action or a ranged attack action, the following sequence is used. Step 1. Make armor rolls. For each successful attack, an armor roll is made by rolling a dice. Most fighters will have an armor value between 2+ and 6+, as determined by the armor they are equipped with. If the result of the armor roll equals or exceeds the armor value of the target fighter, the attack has been saved by their armor and negated. For example, if the target has an armor value of 4+, a dice roll of 4, 5 or 6 will save the attack. Rend. Powerful weapons may have a rend value. If so, each armor roll is modified by the rend value of the weapon being used. For example, if the target has an armor value of 4+, but the weapon has a rend value of -1, a dice roll of a 5 or a 6 will save the attack. If the target fighter has an armor value of dash, or the rend value of the weapon being used makes a successful armor roll impossible, e.g. a 6+ armor value versus a weapon with a -1 rend value, no armor roll needs to be made. The weapon cuts straight through. Step 2. Allocate damage. For each successful attack that was not saved by the target's armor, the target suffers damage equal to the weapon's damage value. If the attack was a critical hit, the target suffers damage equal to the weapon's critical damage value instead. So that's the melee attack sequence. It takes the Kill Team melee attack as its starting point, adds in an initiative step and an armor roll, and then injects unpredictability in 4 different places. Rolling for initiative off the charge, the factor parry can fail on a 1, the armor roll, and the random critical damage. These all combine to create a system full of surprises and nail-biting decisions. At least that's the hope. As I prepare for the playtest, there are various things I have my eye on. I mentioned the life value of fighters, but I also have my eye on that dice roll in the initiative step and the dice roll when parrying. They both have their reasons for being there, but once the prototype is up and running, I will be able to see if they strike the right balance or need adjusting. Alright, let's look at a quick example of how an attack might play out. Let's take a guild mercenary from before and equip him with a sword and a shield and a cuirass, giving him an armor value of 4+. And let's pitch him against a ratman here, a verminkin acolyte armed with 2 daggers. We'll say that the acolyte has charged in, and so will have the initiative. Both fighters roll their dice. The guild mercenary has 3 attacks with the sword, the acolyte has 3 with the dagger, plus 1 additional attack for their offhand dagger. The guild mercenary rolls 1, 4, 6. The verminkin acolyte rolls 4, 5, 6, 6. It's the verminkin to strike first. While they have rolled well, they spot that the guild mercenary currently has a chance to kill them, so they decide to start off more defensively and sacrifice one of their critical hits to attempt to parry away the opponent's crit. Unfortunately, they roll a 1, the parry fails. It's over to the guild mercenary. Now they have a choice. They could also play defensively by using their miss to attempt to parry one of the verminkin's hits, an ability afforded to them by the sword, or they could go for the jugular and attempt to deal some big damage to the verminkin. Although they are in a bad spot, as they have a life value of 4, they can at least survive 1 attack from the acolyte, even a critical hit. So they decide to go on the offensive, spending their own critical hit to deal an attack. The verminkin fails its armor, and the guild mercenary rolls a 3 on the damage, bringing the verminkin down to just its last pip of life. This flips the combat on its head, and suddenly the acolyte is put on the back foot. Close to death, it attempts to save its skin by parrying the guild mercenary's last remaining hit. It's a nerve-wracking roll, but this time it is successful, negating the guild mercenary's remaining hit in the process and ensuring the acolyte will survive into the next round. It's over to the guild mercenary once more. and while they are out of hits to spend, they are able to use their one miss to attempt to parry the Acolyte's remaining hit, an ability granted by the sword. They cannot parry away a critical hit, but they can parry away the Acolyte's regular hit, which they do so. The final turn of this duel is for the Acolyte to spend their critical hit. However, it fails to get past the Guild Mercenary's armor. The combat ends with neither side taken down, but it went from the Acolyte having the advantage when the attack dice were first rolled to them being left bloodied and bruised by the end of the combat due to its twists and turns. So there is a quick example of how the fighting could work. Of course, I cherry-picked the dice results there to make it as exciting as possible, but hopefully it shows you what the system is capable of. There were multiple times when either the Guild Mercenary or the Verminkin Acolyte could have been slain. The advantage flip-flopped between the two throughout the combat, and there was lots of fun decision-making to be had. I'm also excited at what sort of design space I could explore with different weapons. I'm thinking that spears could give a bonus on initiative against the charge, and weapons like flails could be unparryable, making them very good to use as an offhand weapon. The final thing to look at today is the ranged attack system. This is going to be similar to the melee attack system, but because I want it to take a backseat, it's been simplified into 3 steps: attack, armor, damage. Let's look at it in full. Ranged attack action. A fighter equipped with a ranged weapon and who is not engaged in melee can make a ranged attack action as follows. 1. Pick a target. 2. Make attack rolls. Step 1. Pick a weapon and target. The controlling player picks a ranged weapon their fighter is equipped with to use, and an enemy fighter within the range value of the weapon being used to be the target of that attack. The target must be the closest enemy fighter that is visible to their fighter that is not engaged in melee. If the closest eligible enemy fighter is in cover, page XX, the closest eligible enemy fighter not in cover can be targeted instead. Quick note here that page XX is something we used to use at Games Workshop when drafting up rules. One of the final jobs the editors had when it came to getting a book ready to print was to go through and add in the actual page numbers. Step 2. Make attack rolls. The controlling player makes the attack rolls by rolling a number of dice equal to the attack's value of the ranged weapon being used by their fighter. Attack rolls of a natural 6 are successful attacks and are critical hits. Otherwise, each attack roll that equals or exceeds the fighter's bow value is a successful attack. All other attack rolls are misses. Each successful attack is resolved, page XX, then the action ends. So I wanted ranged attacks to take a backseat to melee attacks, and the most important rule here is only being able to target the closest visible enemy fighter. I'm going to be quite strict with that rule. There are other games that have a similar rule but allow a fighter to bypass it by passing a willpower test or something similar. But for me, that undermines its importance. Being able to bypass this rule might be unlocked as a skill, but it won't be available for the majority of your fighters. What I like about a rule like this is it gives the defending player lots of agency in dictating who in their warband can be shot and cannot be shot at. They will be able to keep their important fighters safe by screening them with more expendable ones. In Black Death City, this rule is here to ensure that ranged combat takes a backseat to melee combat. If the enemy wants to take down your prized fighters, they're going to have to get up close and personal. With the inclusion of this rule, I also felt I was free to spice up the critical damage of ranged attacks a little, and this was a way of ensuring that final player experience I wanted could get into the game. That arrows should have a slim chance of being able to kill a man with a single shot. Here is what a short bow looks like. A single shot, but with a critical damage of D6. Against a fighter with a life value of 4, and presuming a 5+ armor value on average, that gives you about a 1 in 18 chance of taking them out in a single shot, or a 5.56% chance. Not great odds, but when it does happen, it could flip the battle on its head and make for a great story. Alright, that's it for this video, which was an in-depth look at the turn structure and combat rules for Black Death City, full of crunchy details. My immediate goal now is to finish putting together that prototype, and I think we're going to get there by the end of next month. So keep your eyes peeled for the next video in this series, where I will showcase hopefully 2 example warbands and an example scenario. These are the last things that the prototype needs, and then it'll be ready to share with you, so I hope to put together a little download for you as well. For those of you creating your own game, I hope this idea of experience-led design is an approach that you find useful. There will be times when you already have a clear idea of how to structure part of your game, but there'll be other times when it will be a lot trickier. You won't have all of the details ironed out yet. And in those cases, thinking about the experiences you want to evoke in your players is a great starting point, as it helps define the design space that you need and gives you a clear goal in what your mechanics should be trying to create on the tabletop. Let me know what you thought of the video down in the comments below, and remember, the next video on this channel is going to be a question time. Ask me anything about Black Death City, games design, or anything else. Look for the pinned comment down below and send your questions my way. Until next time, bye for now.